So I watched Professor Anton and Irelan's video responses to MrCropper before I watched MrCropper's videos, and I was actually expecting him to be uh, far more mean. I was almost worried my feelings would be hurt, and that I'd have to go lick my wounds or something. But uh, really, I'm kind of left with the sense that it really must be wonderful to be an objectivist, because reality is then uh, so simple that a pretty uh, modest system of philosophical concepts and propositions can entirely encompass it, such that you really, after you've learned this system, which is objectively true, uh, you really don't even have to think anymore. You can just apply the system. And it's not that systematic philosophy is a bad idea. It's just that we have to recognize, uh, well, you can never really have a complete system, because reality isn't simple. Reality is complex. And, we didn't need Gödel's incompleteness theorem to know uh, that a system cannot be both complete and consistent, because it can refer to itself. There's this property of reflexivity built into the nature of reality, such that it can always continue seeing deeper into itself, seeing itself from a new perspective. Reality is an evolving process, and so knowledge can't simply be objective. Uh, Knowledge can't be contained in some system which has been finished and that merely has to be memorized and applied for true knowledge to, be in your possession for the rest of your life. Plato wasn't a systematic philosopher. He was a visionary. Most of the best refutations to what are called, Plato's ideas, and just his thoughts, not his theory of ideas specifically, but most of the refutations of Plato's thoughts are in Plato's own dialogues. For him, or at least for him through the mouth of Socrates, language, the spoken word, and especially the written word, could not contain the truth. Never could anything written or spoken offer you an exact replica of the truth. Language is a sort of mnemonic device that the soul has invented in order to help it to remember what it had already known eternally. Now, this, of course, is Plato's central insight, that reality, being, is eternal. It has no beginning and no ending, because then it wouldn't be being. It would not be. And, this is an abstract argument, but let's try to flesh this out. Plato was inheriting the tradition of Parmenides, right? Who said that, most simply put, being is and cannot not be. Parmenides didn't think thought could think non-being. Thought can only think being, and in fact, for Parmenides, thought is being. Now, we see that this can seem like just linguistic tricks with words, right? You could say that it's meaningless to say that being is. I mean, it is a tautology. But the thing is, language has a meaning to it that isn't merely logical. So what on the surface can appear like a logical contradiction is in fact underlying what's made explicit in the signs or symbols, is an implicit mythic polarity, a sort of circularity, which is both contradictory and coherent, both different and the same. Now, this is where Heraclitus comes in. Heraclitus would say that being both is and is not, and so becomes. Becoming is the result of the instability of being. Being can't simply be itself. It's always also not itself. Think of any particular being in the world, anything that we hold. To know what it is, we must simultaneously know what it is not. And somehow everything it participates in both difference and sameness. And this is what I would call a more preferable reading of Plato. His theory of forms as participation in the things of the sensory world, the concrete sensory world, which for you, Cropper, is the only reality. You see, I would never deny the reality of the sensory world, and Plato, I think, at times appears to say that the sensory realm is a mere illusion. Certainly, Parmenides said that. Now, if we get to someone like Hegel, who was trying to understand reality as a dialectical process rather than something that just is, so he's taking the view of Heraclitus, reality both is and is not, and so becomes. Now, with someone like Hegel, we have to come to see knowledge as something that we participate in as well, something that unfolds historically, in time, through the actions of human beings in the world. Now, this participatory understanding of Plato's forms is, I think, expressed symbolically in this myth of the Christian incarnation, or the incarnation of the Word into an embodied existence. The Word has become flesh. Plato, I think, was articulating something similar in a conceptual way with his theory of the participation of forms. What this means is that we don't necessarily have to read Plato as entirely isolating the eternal realm from the earthly and the sensory. Now, I think we have to hold these two contradictory points of view in mind that are both attributed to Plato, because, as I said, Plato is not a systematic philosopher. Aristotle, much more so. Plato he's almost channeling this experience of both the manyness of reality and the oneness of it. He didn't yet intuit evolution, which we had to wait until at least the 18th and perhaps the 19th century to fully understand. But I think this is where Christianity comes in again. Plato didn't have a sense for the importance of history and of evolution, but the Hebraic cultures had a sense of some sort of a plan working itself out in the world, and that human beings were somehow participating in this. And, this is where Hegel's his ethics and his theory of knowledge, his epistemology, and his ontology, because for him, thought and being are not separate, which is why he's still influenced by Parmenides. And that's the thing. We say these thinkers are supposed to be in opposition to one another, but when you're able to think dialectically, opposition, difference, distinction is not other than sameness, identity. Everything participates in each of these, and so eternity and time somehow exist integrally. They are whole, though a whole is also already a part. The part comes out of the whole, and then becomes whole once more. And these are unstable concepts, and I know, Cropper, that you think Hegel is complete nonsense, and so probably most of what I've said complete nonsense. I think we're trying to recognize something beyond mere sense-bound reason, something beyond what our five senses tell us in terms of information about the world and what our intellect can calculate about that information. We can't simply remain fixated on those quite limited capacities. Our experience gives us more than that. And Kant said experience gives us intuition, and that we know the world through intuition, and that our intellect and our senses really give us, the senses, raw material, and the intellect a set of categories. It's our intuition that actually puts us in touch with knowledge, if we can be said to have any. What I think Hegel does is sort of complete the project that Kant started by saying that yes, the I, knows only its own ideas, but that nature is the I, or spirit, externalized, which is necessary for spirit to realize self-consciousness. It has to see itself reflected. And so the mind isn't cut off from reality and so incapable of true knowledge of things themselves, as Kant thought. The mind isn't other than reality, and the subject isn't other than the object. Somehow they participate with one another in an evolutionary or dialectical self-realization, process of coming to ever greater self-awareness. And of course, when you apply Hegel's ethics and epistemology and ontology to the world, to politics, to human economic activity, you get Marxism. Now, granted, governments have done some pretty terrible things with Marxism in the past. You get all sorts of perverted distortions, I would say. And Hegel wrote about this. He wrote about the terror after the French Revolution, when people tried to organize life in this purely rational way, utterly free from tradition or any sort of religious, mythical, spiritual participation in a set of symbolically numinous stories, and what ended up happening was the reign of terror, where people that didn't agree with the newly created, objectively true and rational systems of governance and law had to be killed because they were just wrong about what's obviously true. And I think that is evidence for the immorality of a sort of objectivist philosophy, if applied to reality. If you know the objective truth, and ultimately, with Rand, we were going to say that selfishness is the ultimate virtue, that I can only care about my own, self-contained identity, then we end up with a sort of reign of terror. If an objectivist, government faces opposition from people who disagree with their political philosophy based on what they think is objective, then they're just going to kill them, right? Because they're wrong. Now, so in closing here, I want to try to articulate this three-step process of knowing, of self-knowledge, perhaps. So the idea is this, that we begin as a body in a world inheriting an experience of the past. So in every moment you become, because of all of the feelings that your body receives from its environment. And then, at a stage we'll call alpha thinking, you perceive all of this sensory data and order it, and the world appears to you as a thing that you are thinking about. Now, in this alpha stage, it's quite apparent that there's a separation between you and the world. Now, you don't always say anything about this assumed separation, but because of it, because it's always presupposed, you can then try to, through empirical measurement of the outside objective world, you can begin to develop theories, based on your ability to step back and observe, which you might suppose were capable of explaining how that stuff out there can take place. Now, the problem with alpha thinking is that, well, all the stuff out there, it's not really separate from you, which we should have known and remembered from this, original inheritance of the past into our experience. Every moment of our own experience starts in an entirely non-rational way. It's an emotional inheritance. It's sense data. To make, as soon as we even try to begin to make sense of sense data, it's already ordered by perception and thought. And so it immediately becomes alpha thinking, where a subject appears apart from an object. Now, beta thinking is what I've been doing this whole time, hopefully, which is talking about the fact that we begin, or originally our experience is of a unity with our environment, and we are never other than our environment, but always conditioned by it. Remembering that, and then applying it to our assumed knowledge of an external world through some sort of objective study, what we come to recognize is that somehow this knowledge must not be complete. It must be lacking a further realization, which would show it in an entirely new light. And I think in the revolutions in physics in the 20th century, which I know, Cropper, you've made some videos about, I think what we see with these revolutions, with quantum physics, with relativity, is that, well, first, time and space are relative. And second, that in our attempt to know the ultimate constituents of matter, we discovered only that, our physical experiments based on mathematical formalisms could know only what was already implied by those formalisms from the beginning. And so, as Niels Bohr put it, it's wrong to think that physics tells us what nature is. Physics tells us what we can say about nature. And physics is basically alpha thinking. Beta thinking is philosophy. And I want to read 2 paragraphs from Hegel's Encyclopedia of Logic, from the introduction. This is paragraph 1. Philosophy lacks the advantage, which the other sciences enjoy, of being able to presuppose its objects as given immediately by representation. And, with regard to its beginning and advance, it cannot presuppose the method of cognition as one that is already accepted. It is true that it does, initially, have its objects in common with religion. He's talking about philosophy. Both of them have the truth, in the highest sense of the word, as their object, for both hold that God and God alone is the truth. Both of them also go on to deal with the realm of the finite, with nature and the human spirit, and with their relation to each other and to God as their truth. Hence, philosophy can, of course, presuppose some familiarity with its objects. In fact, it must presuppose this, as well as an interest in these objects. The reason is that in the order of time, consciousness produces representations of objects before it produces concepts of them, and that the thinking spirit only advances to thinking cognition and comprehension by going through representation and by converting itself to it. But when we consider something in thought, we soon become aware that thoughtful consideration implies the requirement that the necessity of its content should be shown, and the very being, as well as the determinations of its objects, should be proved. As a result, the familiarity with these objects that was mentioned above is seen to be insufficient, and making or granting the validity of presuppositions and assurances is seen to be inadmissible. The difficulty of making a beginning arises immediately, because a beginning, being something immediate, does make a presupposition, or rather is itself just that. So when Hegel talks about representation here, he's talking about how the senses present themselves to the mind, to the intellect. And he, of course, wants to say that this representational relation between the senses and the mind is a part of the process of coming to knowledge and understanding. But that this part is only the beginning, and that the larger whole of this process of coming to know the true being of reality includes both alpha and beta thinking, both the sense of a subject appearing over and against an object, which almost immediately comes out of the representational experience of the world, where the senses are inheriting the environment, becoming the feelings of our own body. That grants us this while it is illusory, it still appears, this experience of being in a dualistic opposition to the world, a subject in here, apart from an external world out there. This isn't the end, though. This is one moment in the dialectic, which then, through beta thinking, becomes self-reflective, to the point where pure intellect is discovered. Now, nous, or logos, these concepts are at the same time symbols. They're religious symbols. God and Christ, you could say, the word. Reason, you could say, in a philosophical sense. And it's still it has a religious connotation, and it's transcendent. But of course, the whole point of a participatory idealism, or an incarnational theology, or a Christianity in the sense of what I would call the true meaning of the symbol. This is an attempt to bring this pure intellect back into the world of the senses, and not to deny that we begin on earth. It's just to deny that we end there.